So, hey everybody, today we're talking about if we can preserve our way out of environmental problems. Last time we talked about conservation. I said that there is a difference. We will be getting a bit more into the weeds of what that has looked like in the US context, because that is what I am most familiar with. But preservation is also just as a field of study and a practice is something that is actually pretty inherently from the US. It comes from a lot of different very US impulses of the hunger and desire to prove oneself and to have a history. The US is one of the is still one of the youngest nations out there, like especially youngest like massive nations out there. We're only a couple hundred years old. When you're on a global stage, especially geopolitically, where you have countries that have, thousands of years of history, and in having that history, having a sense of understanding themselves, preservation is a different kind of concern. But when you, I would argue, when you are a younger country, you have a just massive desire to define who you are. And part of the ways that people do that is with history. And history is something that is passed down, sometimes orally, but with the professionalization of history starting in the mid 19th century, um, with that professionalization came the need to have archives, came the need to have the ability to define what the history was and to have some semblance of objectivity. Whether or not that exists has been like a debate, but all of this is to say is that preservation is very similar to conservation in that it is seeking to protect the environment and how it is used. However, preservation, because it has this historical connection and background, like this, sorry, this historical connection to history, it is much more focused with just simply maintaining. It is very tied and maintaining an area by not using it, and potentially like at all, besides it being visited or being cataloged for future researchers and publics. um, Besides that kind of work, just trying to capture a place, and that can be like an actual place like house museums we'll talk about in a second, but also trying to capture vistas, like Yosemite's tunnel view or the geysers in Yellowstone. So these are different projects than trying to conserve, than trying to, when we were talking about Gifford Pinchot last week, this is different than trying to find a sustainable way to use, to, be utilitarian in how you use things. This is very much tied with history and just trying to capture a moment in time in perpetuity. So to capture a moment in time and keep it safe forever so it can continue to be researched and visited. So before we get in the weeds of that, I need to say midterms, good job. Hopefully you turned them in unless you got an extension for whatever reason. Mostly those were through DSP, but they are in the process of being graded. And just as a reminder, we have 2 weeks to get them graded. So thank you for your patience. I am currently this stock image of a white blonde woman with hipster glasses and just a pile of papers in front of my face and soul. We are doing the best that we can. Billy is an all-star. Billy is awesome. Billy is our TA, who is truly a joy and a delight. And we are we are figuring out the labor for the midterms. But just so you know, there are 2 weeks for those to be graded. So thank you so much. If there is, for whatever reason, a reason that you feel that you want your midterm well before that, feel free to email me and I will grade it as quickly as I can. However, if everybody does that, then I will continue to be this stock image of a woman with too many papers in front of her, but I will also maybe have some tears. So just keep that in mind. I promise you probably did better than you may have thought. I tried. The parts of the midterm that still need to be graded are the questions that asked for a short response, as long as you cover the parameters of that question, and not in a surface level way, but you know, dug in and you actually tried to provide some sort of analysis, you used some description, like you really you wrote at least you wrote at least 5 sentences, hopefully more. um, you probably got most, if not all, of the points for that question. So keep that in mind. And again, thank you so much for your patience. Also, we have an extra credit update. I received an email about this weekend. Because I am, again, this person with a lot of papers on her desk, I may not have responded, and I am so sorry. But I am responding now with an extra credit update. Your classmate who informed me that, hey, how does the extra credit work for the extra credit option of attendance work if we already lost a week of lectures we could attend synchronously because of week 2, and then we lost 2 because of the holiday. How is that going to work? And I read that email. I'm like, oh man, they are absolutely correct. When I came up with 17 as a number, I did want to provide some grace because life does happen. But I wanted, for the most part, most folks to attend. So yeah, when I came up with 17, the Juneteenth wasn't approved yet congressionally, and I did not know that we were going to celebrate July 4th on the 5th. So all of this is to say is because we lost 2 days to holidays, you only need to attend 15 lectures instead of the 17 for extra credit. Hopefully this makes you one of these smiley faces. And if you are watching this later and this makes you less of the smiling face, I'm sorry, but you also have another extra credit option. And I really hope people do it because I love reading those essays. All right. So why preserve? So I have 2 very different pictures of things that are preserved by the national park system. So I said earlier, a little bit of this history preservation comes, pretty quickly after the professionalization of history in the mid-19th century. History has always been a thing. People have always been interested in where they came from, so to speak, as a society, as a culture, as a family, etc. History has always existed, but it becomes professionalized in the 1850s or so, 1830s, 1850s. And through that comes a massive need for creating archives. There becomes an upsurgence in making collections of artifacts and antiques and oddities into actual museums. And there comes an interest to make something called parks. Parks before the 1860s didn't exist in the way that we know them to. They didn't exist at all. Parks, some plots of land were called parks, but they were private. They were owned by people who had enough means to actually, have a large swath of land to, maybe use for hunting or maybe use for sport, but they weren't public. We have the first kind of look at what we now understand as parks coming from shortly after the Civil War, where there are so many people grieving and so many people working through the loss of life through the Civil War, that we have a much bigger cemeteries, and we have people actually going to these green spaces, meeting, having community, children playing, and that is actually our first semblance of what we now consider a park. Again, this is in the US context, but because of Euro-American cultural mores, this treatment of a cemetery was actually accepted in ways that it wouldn't necessarily be in other places. Also, with the rapid industrialization of especially urban landscapes, or rural becoming more towns, not quite urban landscapes as we understand them now, there is a need for people to get together and a need for people to be in green spaces. As industrialization, as urbanization continues happening, after the 1860s, we have the railroad, transcontinental railroad in 1869. We have all sorts of different technologies that are connecting things, but also connecting things, connecting people, making life easier. It's also taking things out, and it's also making things disappear. It's also changing literally the landscape. Of course, extraction has always been part of the project of being human. Humans need the environment to live. That is why we're part of the environment. But as far as actually having beautiful places, like this is from Tunnel View in Yosemite. This is I forgot which city that I want to say. Is this New York? I'm unsure actually which city this is. Sorry, but we have these different historical landscapes, whether they're natural or cultural, that as industrialization, and then later urbanization continues, and frankly, these are still problems that we're dealing with. There are calls to make sure that we don't lose everything for the sake of quote unquote progress. And so this is why preservation became an option, and this is why it's different than conservation, which again, conservation is focused on making the best use out of the least amount of natural resources, or like natural products, for the greatest good. So slightly different. Early preservation was actually considered more women's work, and so we have the creation of house museums. A grad student here at UCSB, but in the history department, actually studies this kind of women's or domestic work, in the creation of house museums in really the late 19th and early 20th century. An example of women who did this work were the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, seen here in about 1873, but there's also other groups that were all over the US doing this work. This changes when places like this start to go up for sale through the Homesteading Act, the US Homesteading Act, and also something called the Timber and Stone Act. And both of these are coming around during the mid 19th century and making places like this, these seemingly blank spaces. Of course, they weren't. We know that there were indigenous folks who were living there. There were indigenous folks who probably lived there before them. Even like, and then don't get us started on the plants and animals. We know that this isn't just a blank space where nothing happens. However, the US law started believing that it was just a blank slate that needed to have big old cities put on it. And so that also raised the pressure to make sure that not everything was lost for someone's idea of progress. So, one of the first places where this happens, the first kind of natural areas is Yellowstone, but also Yosemite. So this is where some things get tricky. So in 1863, President Lincoln signs legislation from the battlefield, because this is during the Civil War, from the battlefield to give the land of Yosemite and its valley to the state of California to protect. This isn't a really clear piece of legislation, but it is an order that, for the most part, is accepted, and it at least halts some of the development in Yosemite. Yellowstone gets a more robust treatment, and it is established in 1872 as the first national park. This is before we have a National Park Service. It isn't really clear what it means to have a national park, but Congress approved it and provided protection of the area by a military, the military, specifically cavalry, to try to operate the park. So we have this in 1872. Yosemite and Sequoia join in 1890. We start to have other parks. And then we eventually have something called the National Park System that starts in 1916. National parks have been called America's best idea. A lot of people will agree with that, even if they see some of the shortcomings of the National Park Service, the shortcomings of preserving. There's still a call to be at least pretty proud that we didn't just make cities out of everything. Or again, as we've hinted to in previous lectures, as we'll continue to get into today, we know that this is a messy idea, but many people, including Wallace Stegner, who said this famous quote, is many believe that national parks are America's best idea. So the National Park Service cares for special places saved by the American people so that all may experience U.S. heritage. This is the word that has been used since the very beginning. There are many problems with this goal. One that we can see is clearly is in Mount Rushmore. These are the heads of 4 U.S. presidents that was carved into the Black Hills, which were and continue to be a very important place of cultural and spiritual knowing for the Sioux people of the Dakotas. Some man just decided to just hustle on up these here stones, these here rocks, and carve US, so colonizing, settling presidents, some of whom, owned slaves, some of whom didn't completely free enslaved people, some of who tried to wrestle with a bear, as we can see with Teddy Roosevelt. these are not representative of the Sioux. And there was also no asking, there was also no permission. And that lack of permission continued when it was eventually made into a national park site. Um, let's see. So there are also problems in that it is controlled by the federal government. The federal government has a turnover at between 4 to 8 years. We only presidents hopefully continue to only serve two terms. So we have a lot of government turnover because it isn't just the president who changes jobs, it's also members of their cabinet, the National Park Service, and all of the preservation work that it does, especially environmental preservation. Can and have been to be understood in very political terms the entire time. And when you have people in power who do not believe or see the merit of this kind of work, you get a lot of problems. So if you remember in 2017, the creation of the Alt National Park Service, very quickly after the inauguration of the 45th president, he got into a Twitter tiffle with the National Park Service, which led to the creation of the Alt National Park Service, which then led to other really rough things happening in and around the National Park Service, including the inability to talk about climate change in parks and through park brochures directly. So that is a problem. You have something that isn't quickly understood to be political, becoming political. There's also the issue of who owns it and why they own it, and ideas of whose heritage is being secured, right? As we can see here, and whose land it actually is. This is from the Alt National Park Service, and it says resist. That's great. We feel good. We feel like we're doing it. We feel like we're fighting the man, but we're also still the man. We're also taking land from other people and making it our own. We're also taking places that have stories and that don't even involve us, and instead are putting our own on that. And that's a problem. That creates erasure. It also creates just cognitive dissonance as far as understanding what nature is, who it's for, who should be there, and who should access it. So someone asked in the chat, not familiar with this. The alt is reappropriating the use of alt and alt-right. It is not an alt-right movement. It was a push back against the alt-right, and especially the 45th president, when he again tried to fight with the National Park Service, who tweeted a picture of his inauguration compared to the inauguration of the president before him. So you can look it up. It's just Alt NPS. They have cool merch. But it was acts of resistance within the National Park Service to try to push against really conservative politics that were trying to disband a lot of services that the National Park Service provides. And we'll get into what those services are in a minute. So the National Park Service cares for, I believe this number has changed. I think this is a year or two old, but cares for 384 national parks in 49 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and anywhere else likely that the US will attempt to colonize and spread their imperial power, um, if they ever do that again. So, here, I mean, you can find a better map. You can see that there's a lot on the coasts. There's more on the East Coast because the U.S. started there. The U.S. came late to the game, so to speak. Entering statehood around 1850. So there's lots of the National Park Service is usually thought for its national parks, but of course, there are so many different kinds of areas that it preserves. And I bring this up because while national parks are most clearly related to what we're talking about, in environmental studies one, the cityscapes, the houses, the historical place, the historical insides, the places where history happened in buildings, all of these things are still part of the National Park Service. And remember that the division between society and nature is one that's constructed. These places, these house museums, these important buildings where laws were passed, the Hamilton rooms where things happened, like these are all natures too, and especially because culture is part of nature as well. um while they may not be as pretty, and even, I'm not going to use the word pristine, but pretty and romantic looking as some of the historical vistas in like actual national parks like Yellowstone, like Zion. They're still just as important and still part of what we need to consider for this class. Um, they get a lot of people. I think behind this image is actually, hold on, is my information. Sorry, we'll come back to the slideshow in a minute. So some National Park Service numbers for you. 2.4. They have a budget of at least $2.4 billion. These numbers are again a couple years old, but they're roughly giving you a ballpark. They have at least, I mean, pre-COVID, they have at least 286 million annual visits. So this is more than Disney attractions, Universal Studios, and NFL games combined. Just on their website alone, they'll get 136 million visits a year, and they have 84 million acres of preserved land. Let's go back to the slideshow again, sorry. More national park numbers for you. Almost 200,000 students and 20,000 teachers participate in parks as classroom programs. There's also something, if you are ever interested in becoming a K through 12 teacher, there's a program called Teacher Ranger Teacher that helps teachers become rangers in their own classrooms. There's other programs that focus on creating, conserving, and preserving habitats for endangered species, and at least in the NPS, in the National Park Service, there's at least 168 threatened or endangered species that they're doing this work for. There's more than 80 million museum objects. They have 1.5 million archaeological sites, which sounds like a lot. Here is an image of some of it happening. And you can see they're in just a pretty small area. And this is what an archaeological site looks like. It can be as small as this or as big as things as big as sites that you've seen in movies like Indiana Jones. Also, within the National Park Service, there are 26,000 historic structures, and all of these And being someone who has worked on multiple historic structures within the National Park Service, I will say that they are definitely part of the environment. They are definitely part of the ecosystem and are part of the history and the knowing of the places that they're situated in. That's part of the preservation that's at play. But they're in need of more money, even though $2 to $3 billion a year sounds like a lot, and also, they get like daily use and camping money. That still isn't enough. They have a lot of land. They have a lot of programs going on. So they have different kind of partnerships like the National Park Foundation, which is their non-profit partner, and that raises at least $35 million in grants. Most major parks have their own conservancy foundations, so they're also doing fundraising. There's a lot of parks that apply for just so many different kinds of grants because the government will not pay to actually do it. An example of this is the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, which helps locally led efforts to plan greenways, conserve rivers and watersheds, and create trails with more than 900 communities assisted since 1988. This actually is more common in the Southeast, but there have been programs that have been done, more closer to UCSB. There's also a land and water conservation fund that provides, 50% matching grants. They provide $3.2 billion more than the National Park Service has. They also provide $259 million in park rehabilitation funds with 400 jurisdictions, 42 states. They help states and localities acquire surplus federal land, and they have 1,200 properties recycled in 50 states. So I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you with these different programs, but I am doing that to, again, illustrate that this kind of work does on a national level does not have enough money going into it, and that's why they have to have these different workarounds of fundraising from individuals or also companies. They also have to make use of different forms of funding from more flexible government funds. It is a mess. And I, again, am focusing on this so much because I know a lot of environmental studies folks are really interested in pursuing parks. I am one of them. However, it is really important to know that some of this work doesn't always work the way we want it to. Maybe I'm just saying that for me, but but also I think that it's necessary to consider when we think about what preservation work can actually do. And if it actually helps the environment, if all of this money has to be put in that isn't clear where it can come from, is it even doing the work that it needs to do? If you're getting a whole bunch of money from McDonald's and sponsored by Visa, if you're creating an industrial tourist industry, as Edward Abbey discusses in his polemic, are you even preserving anything? Are you even preserving nature? And this is something that a lot of folks go back and forth on, even within the Park Service. I have my own opinions, but I've given you enough of my own opinions so far, and you can ask me later if you are interested. Another one happens more in the US West. We have the National Trails System, where we have 17 national and scenic trails that are administered or jointly administered with the NPS, and that's 38,000 miles. So again, the scope of what NPS does is just truly ginormous, in the US, and it speaks to the desire to have preservation. But again, all of these separate programs also speak to a lack of funding to actually do this work. Finally, a designation that NPS looks over is National Heritage Areas. Um, and National Heritage Areas are the buildings, important fixtures of a city or a town, important areas that need to be remembered, partially because of how they contribute to the understanding of the landscape they're in. So, with that being said, there's more than 1 million properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This can also be called the NRHP. They have to work with different state historical preservation officers to ensure that they are not only preserving something that needs to be preserved, but they're doing so in a way that does not impact the broader environment, which, isn't, again, not just flora and fauna, water and land, it's also people. There's also tribal grants, and the National Park Service works with over 100 Indian tribes in protecting unique and endangered cultures. So here we can see the Port Gamble Squalum tribe in Washington. There are different partnerships more close to home with the Channel Islands and the Chumash. There are lots of collaboration that needs to happen, frankly, because there's a lot of stakeholders that hope for preservation of special spaces and places, lands and waterways. Yeah. Why did it do that? Okay. Sorry. What? So this is not how I wanted to talk about one of my favorite topics, transnational parks, but here we are. So national parks started in the US. However, there are transnational parks that have started since, I think the first one was in the 80s. There's this awesome book. It's a collection edited by Mark Fiji called National Parks Beyond the Nation that look at these different examples. Here's a national park from China. They have a lot of, all of these, transnational parks, these national parks that are outside of the US, potentially going through multiple countries, especially in Europe. This is common. Think of the Alps. There are similar concerns of how do you preserve the landscape? How do you ensure that the land is managed in a way where we can have the same view of it forever? So this is just to say this is not just a US issue, even though a lot of these ideas are did stem from the US. Okay. Again, sorry for, I don't know why my PowerPoint didn't want to work with me today. So what makes these things possible are legislation. The first is the Antiquities Act of 1906. And this established the first federal policy for the protection of cultural resources on land owned or controlled by the federal government. And it also authorized the president the power to create national monuments by proclamation to protect historic, prehistoric, and scientific objects on federally owned land. This is a really important piece of legislation. It's also been used and abused since 1906. There have been claims of eminent domain, which is a power that the federal government also can have to seize property from individuals. So people, again, have used this to steal land from folks, especially indigenous people and Black, indigenous people of color, just more generally. Also the poor, even poor Euro Americans. So it gets complicated, but it is a big reason why we have the National Park Service, we have different state park services, and we have a lot of partnerships with other groups to do this kind of work. So we have the National Park Service, started with the Organic Act of 1916. This is when Congress created the National Park Service and prescribes the fundamental purpose to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same, as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So again, this loops back to what we started this lecture with, that the US, as a relatively young country, wanted to capture whatever the essence of what they feel the US is, and all of its different natures, and wanted to make sure that it could be understood and seen, quote unquote, unimpaired. Of course, that's impossible, but they still wanted to try, but unimpaired for future generations. I say unimpaired is impossible because nature changes, ecosystems change, whether it's how flora and fauna interact, a tree gets cut down, animals die, species go extinct naturally, as without human intervention, as we've talked about. In creating national parks, you have to create infrastructure for tourists to come in. It's impossible for it to be unimpaired, but they make the best attempt that they can to conserve and preserve the general feeling of a place, which is how the preservationists I know have described it to me. This work further gets complicated with the Historic Sites Act of 1935, and this is where the U.S. Congress articulated a national policy of historic preservation, and this created administrative infrastructure to make it possible. So this created the bureaucracy that, if you've ever worked in or around national parks or even state parks, you are familiar with. But this act is is really what connected the National Park Service to the federal government rather than the military, because it directed the Secretary of the Interior to secure, collate, and preserve drawings, plans, photographs, and data of historic and archaeological sites, buildings, objects, restore buildings, erect markers, and develop educational programs. So this is really just going in more deeply into ensuring that preservation continues. We have some things in the chat. Natalie asked, what makes it transnational? Does our NPS own them? No, it is transnational because a lot of times parks in other countries collaborate with our NPS. And so NVD, you say transnational land acquisition refers to buying land in foreign countries and areas. NPS manages publicly owned lands in the US. Yeah, but also depending on how you define the US, it can be transnational within the continental 48 states if the NPS tries to impede on tribal land, or arguably the NPS work in Guam or even and the Virgin Islands, for example, even though they're territories, that can be understood to be transnational as well. I hope that kind of clears things up. All right. And Billy, as usual, came in clutch with saying, I'm not sure if NPS has directly purchased land in other countries, but they, along with other Department of Interior members, have helped establish parks in other countries directly and indirectly in a variety of ways. This inevitably gets tied up with larger foreign policy efforts at any given time as well. Look at Billy go. Thank you so much. So, the preservation movement's success hinges on the idea of going beyond, quote, the occasional historic houses and opening museums. It must attempt to give a sense of orientation to our society using structures and objects of the past to establish values of time and place. So, this comes from a, uh, a project that was done in the 60s. It was a collaboration of historians and the National Park Service called With Heritage So Rich. And this is what preservation can do. It is bringing together the spaces and places that are important to how a wide swath of the population understands themselves being in the US, and also considering how people in or from other countries think of the US, and trying to conserve and preserve that for as long as humanly, uh, but physically, emotionally, politically, like financially, most definitely possible. So with the project that I mentioned, there also came the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, in which Congress broadened the federal government's concept of historic preservation to include sites, objects, districts, and structures of national, state, and local significance. A quote from it is: "The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and developed in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people." Um, while this is, while they tried to make this into being a beautiful thought, of course, well, what is a community? This is only 2 years after the Civil Rights Act. So the country still at this time was rife with racism, as we still are today, but even more so. So, like, what is a community? Who is part of the community? What is America? Who are Americans? And I'm not saying this to be contrary, or I'm not saying this to get a rise out of anyone. It's truly a question. When we have these kind of words used in legislation, the legislation continues longer than the historical moment that it was written in. And this is the work that lawyers have to do when they try to uphold these laws that were passed decades ago. And this gets even more complicated when you have law that deals directly with natural resources, because of course that can provide so much money, and so people will fight for policy to be understood in their favor if it will, you know, enrich them in some ways. This happens a lot with, or tries to be done with NEPA, or the National Environment Policy Act, from 1969. And this has a relationship to historic preservation because it established the environmental impact statement, or uh, professionally, this is called EIS, or an EIR, an environmental impact report. And the fact that there is a continuing federal responsibility to, quote, preserve important historical, cultural, and natural aspects of our heritage. So we see natural is put right in with historical and cultural. These things are all directly in conversation with each other, working together and making the world as we understand it today. uh, Doing this work, the government has tried to make it attractive to do this kind of preservation work. So in the 70s and 80s, you have lots of different tax reforms to help encourage private owners of historic places to work with the Secretary of the Interior, to work with the National Park Service, to ensure that if the National Park Service couldn't, for whatever reason, either whether it be money or a person or a property owner does not want to sell, that historic places would still be preserved, and the owners would get their benefit through like access to money and grants at points, but definitely tax cuts, which people have gladly taken on and used, and that is part of the reason why the NPS has so many sites today. Many of these came after the 70s. And that's it. So we covered a lot. I'm gonna stop sharing. I switched locations. I'm sorry. I needed to plug in my phone. So sorry if this is coming to you a little weird. I'm gonna stop recording.